So we're going to give a little bit of time for more people to jump on. Right now we have almost 100 of you guys on here. So big Zoom, Celiac space Friday party. But today we're going to be going over label reading things. So all things label reading. I'm going to do kind of some slides, go over stuff. I have some products to show you, and we'll walk through things. There are also, if you've been around, you know about my no and woe list. If you don't, I'll cover what that is. But we're going to be changing some of the recommendations for the good. So I know a lot of you guys were concerned because you're like, are you going to put more things on the list? Have I been eating things that I shouldn't have? No, you have not. We're going to be freeing up the list. So that is kind of the agenda for today. I'm going to pull up my screen and share it with you guys. I lost you. Okay. All right. So the topic today is how to be an expert in gluten-free labels. I know that this is probably one of the trickiest topics for anybody going gluten-free. And then beyond that, it is probably one of the most important skills of being gluten-free. So I think even though I have clients that work with me and have worked with me for a while, it's still something that they struggle with. So this is, I think, super important for everybody to have a really great grasp on it. If you have questions during this session, you can put them in the chat box. I will do my best to answer them before time's up. And then if I don't get to them, I'll send you an email or we'll include them in a follow-up email so everybody can get the answer to that. But if you have questions, drop them in the chat. All right. So for anybody that doesn't know me, I am Erin. I'm the founder of the Celiac Space. I am a registered dietitian, so I went to school. I have a master's in nutrition. I did a lot of like clinical practice and stuff in nutrition to become a dietitian. I live in Austin, Texas. I have a cool dog. I have a fiance. I'm from California. And I've been celiac for almost 10 years now. And I currently run the Celiac Space. We have 2 other dietitians that work with us and a wonderful like support team behind the scenes. We provide resources like this through webinars, through free materials on Facebook, Instagram, and also work a lot with one-on-one clients. So that's kind of like our bread and butter is supporting our one-on-one clients and kind of helping them through adjusting to the gluten-free life. And then beyond that, improving gut health, weight loss, whatever their kind of goals are. So that's kind of what we do here and who I am. So today we're going to talk about the no and the woe ingredients. If you are familiar with the celiac space, you know what those are, and you'll know even more about them in the updates by the end of this. If you don't know what they are, you will learn what they are. Along those lines, changes to the no and woe list, and then why I'm making those recommendations. As a dietitian, everything that I state, say, recommend, is coming from a medical and a science background, right? So I didn't just like read a book and I'm explaining it to you. There is research to support what I am saying, and I make sure that there are things that the medical community is also agreeing with and recommending. And then just in general, how to read a gluten-free label. So those are kind of the big things that we'll cover. So no and woe ingredients. A no ingredient is an ingredient that contains gluten always. This should be avoided. These are things like barley, rye, wheat, wheat bran, like anything that is straight gluten, we would avoid those always and forever. Those are things that if you see them on a food label, red flag, don't press go, do not eat those foods. A woe ingredient is something that should give you pause. In some cases, a woe ingredient could be gluten-free, and in some cases, it may not be gluten-free. Usually on the label, sometimes we'll have enough information to know, sometimes we won't. And the reason why these ingredients, like sometimes you can eat them and sometimes you can't, is sometimes they're derived from something that's gluten-free and sometimes they're derived from something that isn't gluten-free. We'll get into examples of what those look like, but these woe ingredients are the trickiest ones. And this is where it takes a little bit of digging. These are the ingredients where people say, you know, it's hidden gluten. It's not hidden, you just need to know to look for it. So this was our previous woe list. I've had this list for a little over 2 years. And this is what we're going to make some changes to. This is also the no list. So again, whoa ingredients are things that should give you a pause. Sometimes they're safe, sometimes they're not. We'll go over how to decide if they're safe or not. And then a no ingredient, it always contains gluten. Do not eat it. So this is the whoa list. These are the updates. Take a quick peek, but we'll go over every single one of them and why we're making the changes. The biggest one is going to be caramel color and maltodextrin. And this is our no list. We are changing some things, we're removing some stuff. Again, we'll go over why. But you guys will all get in the email follow-up these new updated lists so that you guys can screenshot them, save them to your phone, print them out. Honestly, if you're living gluten-free, these should be like the back of your hand. Should be something that you pretty much memorize because this is how you're going to be able to look at a food label and say, can I eat that or can I not? So super important. All right, so getting into why I'm making these recommendations and what those changes are. So the first reason is to simplify the list. There are some things on there that are a little bit repetitive, and if you look at the list, it's kind of just overwhelming. And so sometimes things get missed that are important. Or if you're new to being diagnosed, it's like, oh my gosh, that's about a million things. I can't memorize that. So we're simplifying it, and I hope that providing some education will help you guys understand it better in a more simplified way. And then there's also some updated label laws. Now, these are not super new updated label laws. However, it did take some time for the manufacturers, the producers, the food chain to update everything. And for example, I'll get into some examples, but some things used to be sourced from wheat. And now that we understand more that things need to be sourced from gluten-free stuff like corn, more companies started to transition to corn-based or rice-based products like maltodextrin. And so we really started to kind of filter out wheat from our food chain for certain ingredients. But it did take some time to do this. So I didn't update my no and woe list as soon as the laws changed because there were still plenty of products on the shelves in grocery stores and shelves in people's houses that still followed old laws. And so I think we are far enough out from those changes. And based on everything that I have seen over the past few years, I think we are beyond the safe level and the safe kind of timeline for the adjustment of these laws. And the third one, and the reason why I want to have this webinar to explain everything, is to truly give more freedom for safe gluten-free food options. Gluten-free is limiting enough, and I think especially with the low ingredients for things like maltodextrin, caramel color, natural flavors, those seem to be in every food. And so it can be really limiting if you don't understand if you can have them or if you can't have them. So I want to allow more food freedom in a safe way. Of course, I'm not going to open up the woe list and just take things off just for shits and gigs. There are reasons behind it, which we will cover. Also moving forward, kind of talking about labeling laws. So there's two big laws that we are following. The first one is the FDA regulation that states gluten-free is less than 20 parts per million. So on any package, if it says gluten-free, it's less than 20 parts per million, which is below the threshold that's allowed to be celiac safe. So in short terms, if it says gluten-free and you have celiac disease, gluten sensitivity, gluten intolerance, whatever, obviously those are different, but for whatever reason you're avoiding gluten, if it says gluten-free on the package, it is within the safe limit. It is within the safe limit to have many of those food items, right? So for example, a slice of bread, you might think, well, if I have one slice of bread that's less than 20 parts per million, I'm safe. But if I have two slices of bread, logically you'd think, now I've had more than 20 parts per million, now am I at risk? But when we made that recommendation, I say we, meaning the medical community, made that recommendation, we understood that people were going to be having more than one of those servings of gluten-free product. So that's important to know. So gluten-free on a package means FDA regulated to be less than 20 parts per million. The other one is the law, which stands for Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act. That is the law that regulates the top 8 allergens. Now, gluten is not a top 8 allergen. The top 8 are milk, eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, shellfish, soy, and wheat. Wheat is the top 8 allergen, but barley and rye are not. And those also make up gluten. However, those make up such a small portion of gluten. So that's something really important to remember, and we'll kind of dive into that a little bit more throughout this. How do we go to my next slide? Okay, so starting, we're moved from the WOE list. So we're removing these two trichotum products. This is the scientific name for wheat. On a food label, they would use their common name, they would use wheat. So due to regulations, only common or usual names is required on a food list. I have not seen products with this labeling anymore. I've looked and it doesn't exist. So we're removing it from the list. It would be called wheat bran, whatever type of wheat is on there, but they wouldn't call it by their scientific name anymore. Also removed from the list are these 3 terms: hydrolysate, hydrolyzed plant protein, and hydrolyzed vegetable protein. So along the same lines as the FDA is requiring companies to provide the common name, instead of just wording something as vegetable protein or plant protein, they have to be specific about it. And so if it is wheat protein, which is gluten, it must be worded as hydrolyzed wheat protein. So we've added hydrolyzed wheat protein to the no list and removed all of these more vague terms, because things like hydrolyzed vegetable protein could be soy, and that's perfectly safe. And we see that in more products, but they're more likely now going to be putting hydrolyzed soy protein. And if it is hydrolyzed wheat protein, they must include that word wheat in there. So we can remove these vague terms from the WOE list, and we'll add the hydrolyzed wheat protein to the no list. Next one is the scientific term for rye. So again, on the food label, we would use the common name for rye. So this isn't a word we need to remember. This isn't a word that you're going to see very often. Goodbye. Let's make it simple. The 4th one, this was on the WOE list, and this is a big, tricky one. Caramel color. We are removing this from the list, which should open up a lot of food options for us, which I think is exciting. And remembering that the food options likely were safe before, but because we weren't sure, we kind of erred on the side of caution. But caramel color previously was made from gluten-containing grains, specifically barley and wheat. However, in North America, all caramel color now is derived from gluten-free sources. So the reason we held off, and I kept this on the WOE list for a while, is it took a while for the supply chain to change and for caramel color to be from gluten-free sources. This is supported by Beyond Celiac and celiac.org. This is their recommendation as well. So that's kind of why we're changing it. There is a small chance that wheat could be used in UFOs, in foreign products, but that would still have to be regulated through the FDA as products are imported. And if there ever was something sourced from wheat, it would not be enough to be containing gluten, because the caramel color is made by heating up the carbohydrate, and so it's very, very processed. So that's something that's important to know. So caramel color, we are removing it from the WOE list. The next big one that I'm removing is maltodextrin. This is something that is really common in a lot of products. Maltodextrin is a highly processed starch. So a starch is a grain or something like a potato, any kind of carbohydrate, or most carbohydrates. And previously, we could have made maltodextrin from a wheat source because that's cheap. But as you know, the food companies realized that they wanted more gluten-free products, and more laws and stuff were passed, we started to change things to change that source of the starch to be corn, potatoes, or rice. So they're all gluten-free. Even when maltodextrin is from wheat, in the small chance that it is, it's so processed and purified that it's considered to be gluten-free and celiac safe. So remembering that maltodextrin is the starch form of a grain, gluten is the protein form. So they're very different anyways, and maltodextrin is so processed that if it's from wheat, it is purified enough to be considered gluten-free and celiac safe. This is supported by the FDA, Beyond Celiac, and celiac.org. So we kind of all agree on these things. One thing to keep in mind is in some cases, so you might see on, I'm trying to think of the food product example, but there may be a contains line that says contains wheat on there if they do source maltodextrin from wheat. So that's something that you could potentially look for, but again, it is processed enough. I personally would eat it, and this is kind of my recommendation. So we're moving it from the WOA list. It's too processed, and typically it's not even derived from wheat anyway. 6.1 removed from the WOA list is this extract. This was previously in food, but now it's mostly in beauty products, so it's no longer needed to be on the WOA list for food products. I know there are many questions about gluten in beauty products, and I could go on for a long time about that, but the gist of it is that your skin does not absorb gluten, and it is the recommendation, and the research shows that if you have celiac disease, you don't need to use gluten-free beauty products. If you personally have a reaction or you have sensitive skin, then go for it, use gluten-free beauty products, but that isn't necessary, with the exception of things that go in, on, or around your lips and mouth, like toothbrush, toothpaste, that kind of thing. I guess you don't need your toothbrush. Toothpaste, mouthwash, chapstick, you know. All right, another one. This is the only one that we've added to the list. This is rare to find that it contains gluten, and this was previously kind of into the categories of natural flavors, but I wanted to separate it a little bit more just to be a little bit more extra protective, and that's smoke flavor. And the process to make smoke flavor may, not always, but may possibly, which is why it's a WOA food, use barley malt flour to capture the smoke. It's very unlikely the final product is enough gluten, but we're always going to err on the side of caution. This, I expect, is likely going to be something along the same lines as maltodextrin and caramel color, where eventually we use another malt flour, like rice malt flour, to capture that smoke flavor. But for now, we're going to put it on the WOA list and separate it out from natural flavors. Another change is brewer's yeast. So brewer's yeast used to be a no food, and we have changed it now to a WOA food. There have been new developments and ways to process and make brewer's yeast to make it gluten-free. So if the label states gluten-free, it would be celiac safe. Typically it is from barley, and if it was from barley, then we would avoid it. But if the label says gluten-free, it's celiac safe. And when we get into more about the no and WOA list, you'll kind of understand when to pick a WOA food, like if it has a WOA ingredient, when to trust it and when to not. But there are some brands of gluten-free brewer's yeast. So Blue Bonnet Super Earth is one, and Lewis Labs is another one. And both of those use sugar beet instead of barley. So we're moving brewer's yeast from an always a no to a WOA to hopefully open up some options. And as I think the food chain changes and companies have more ways to make brewer's yeast, it'll be a more option for us. So some changes to the no list. Breading was on there previously. I decided to remove this because it's more of a product than an ingredient. So with like, it'll say breading and then in parentheses, no foods or WOA foods or whatever that may be. So we're moving breading from the list. Matzo is the same. It's a product, more of an ingredient. You can get gluten-free matzo, whereas previously you couldn't. So if it was on the label, it would list out all the ingredients. So that's why we're removing it. Number 11 is gliadin. This is one of the two proteins that make up gluten. And if gluten was on the product, it would be labeled by the ingredient name, not the type of protein. This is along the same lines as previous ones that were on the WOA list, where due to regulations now, only the common or usual name is required. So we're going to remove this. It's not seen on food labels anymore. This is a big one. We are removing malt extract, malt flavoring, malt syrup, malt vinegar, and malted milk from the no list, but we are replacing with the term malt. So we're switching out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and just using the word malt, since they are pretty much all the same. Malt, for the most part, is a barley product. There are some products being used that are rice malt, but that is still pretty rare. Hopefully, in the next few years, that'll be more common. But for now, we are just simplifying it and making it malt. So here's our updated no list. You can see just malt right here. We have our updated WOA list. It's much simpler, pretty exciting. We will send this all out to you in an email as well. So how to read a gluten-free label. Looking at this flow chart, so is this gluten-free? First, starting with a certified gluten-free label, those are these 4 up here. If the product has a gluten-free label, one of these certified ones, then it is tested third party, it has very strict protocol, it is always safe. You literally need to look at nothing else, it's gluten-free. If it does not say gluten-free on the package, if it does not have one of these labels, then we look and see if it says gluten-free. If it says gluten-free on the package, then we know it is safe. Again, it follows less than 20 parts per million. It's good to go. The exception is oats, and I could talk all day about oats, but I'm going to link my whole spiel on oats to keep this a little bit short. Oats is the exception to the rule. The short story of it is, if it has oats, it either needs a certified gluten-free label or it needs to say gluten-free oats. That's the exception. But otherwise, in all other cases, if it says gluten-free on the package, it's safe. If it does not say gluten-free on the package, we look to see if it contains a no or a WOA ingredient. If it does not, then it is gluten-free, because then it would be naturally gluten-free. No and WOA ingredients are the only ones that potentially could be questionable. So if it doesn't contain a no or WOA, it's safe. It doesn't need to say gluten-free. It doesn't need to certify gluten-free. It's naturally gluten-free. We don't need to worry about cross-contact. We don't need to worry about processing. We trust it. And I know that that's something that is a little bit controversial, especially in Facebook groups. But unfortunately, those recommendations don't come from research. And the research shows that we don't need to worry too much about that. And I'm happy to share that research with anybody that wants to see that information. But there's a lot to say about that. If it does contain a no or WOA ingredient, it would not be gluten-free, right? Because if it contains a no ingredient, always and forever, it's not gluten-free. If it contains a WOA ingredient and doesn't say gluten-free on the package, then we don't know if that WOA ingredient is from a gluten-free source or not. So for example, if one of our WOA ingredients is natural flavors. If it said natural flavors on it, and it didn't say gluten-free, then those natural flavors could be sourced from a gluten-containing grain. So we would probably err on the side of saying it's not gluten-free. With a WOA ingredient, you could look further. You could look on the company website or the manufacturer. But if you're just standing in the aisle at the grocery store and you're not sure, then you would want it to say gluten-free, but at a no or a WOA ingredient. If it had a no ingredient, it would never say gluten-free. But if it had a WOA, it could say gluten-free. Again, the exception is oats, and I will link in the emails kind of the whole spiel about oats with that. But the gist of it is oats should either be certified gluten-free or made with certified gluten-free oats. This part is some gray area. So this is the fine print on a food label, right? So made on equipment with, made in a shared facility. Both of these two top ones are voluntary statements. So made on equipment with, this one is a little bit tricky. So products made on shared lines can still be safe. There are cleaning protocols in place. Companies are going to wash things in between just because they don't want one product tasting like the other. We truly don't need to worry too much about shared lines. The risk of a product being made on a shared line being greater than 20 parts per million is so minimal. I know in many Facebook groups, they're telling you, call the manufacturer. Most of the time, the manufacturer isn't going to say anything. And if they do, they're going to tell you something along the lines of, it's safe. Or they're going to tell you something along the lines of, like a PC answer or like a legal answer, basically saying don't eat it because we don't want the liability. But there is research to support that that really isn't a risk. So if it says made on shared equipment and you want to take it one step further and be extra cautious, then get a product that says gluten-free, because then we know it's tested to be less than 20 parts per million. But remembering that this is a voluntary statement. So I assure you that you have products in your own kitchen that are made on shared lines that don't say it on the package because the company decided not to put it on there. And those products are safe and just fine. So that's a little bit tricky. The made in facility with honestly doesn't mean much. I recommend eating products that are made in a shared facility. If you go out to a restaurant, if you have gluten in your own home, any food that you eat is then made in a shared facility. These places are massive, and so just having a bag of flour, this is a dramatic example, but having a bag of flour 3 stories up of a manufacturing plant is not a risk. So this is something that I'm 1,000% okay with eating in a shared facility. Stuff that we do avoid is if it ever says contains wheat or gluten or says may contain. It is not mandatory for a product to say contains gluten. It is mandatory for a product to say contains wheat. But remembering that that doesn't include barley and rye. So yeah, like we can't just read a label by the may contains line or contains line, but this may be helpful to rule something out. If it says this, it wouldn't be helpful to rule something in, meaning you couldn't just look at the label and say, it doesn't say contain gluten or it doesn't say contain wheat, so I can eat it. We want to follow this instead, this flow chart. All right, so that was our quick and dirty of reading gluten-free label. I will be answering all of the chat questions in an email and a follow-up. And then, of course, if you guys need more resources, we have the label reading guide that will be sent to you in our PDF, Instagram, where I answer questions and provide resources, and our Facebook group. So those are all great places. We'll also be having the Living and Loving Your Gluten-Free Life course coming out shortly in the spring, and that will be another place where we do labels and other resources for you guys. So I hope that was helpful. I am going to follow up with you guys with more resources and emails. So this will be recorded for everybody. If you want to send it, you'll get the PDF guides as well. And I'll answer all the questions in there and send the oats. So all things to follow up. I hope you guys have a great Friday, and I'll see you guys either in the Facebook group or on social media, or if you're my client, on our video calls together. So have a great week, everybody. Bye.